Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. Just over 3 years ago, I released episode 91, The Sherry Murders, the Dixie Mafia and Corruption in Biloxi. The way organized crime in Biloxi and the dangerous and powerful Dixie Mafia in particular began and went on to operate played a fundamental role in the story of the 1987 murders of Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret. Throughout the episode, I sprinkled information about the hows, whos, and whys of relevant Dixie Mafia activities and corruption to give an overall socio-historical context and essence of place and time. But there is much more to this criminal enterprise's sordid and seedy history aside from the Sherry case. I've been inundated with requests for a standalone episode on the Dixie Mafia. So this one, while not exhaustive, is solely dedicated to exploring the profound impact the network's operations had on life and the law in the South. Welcome to bonus episode 194, The History of the Dixie Mafia. If you're not familiar with the story of the Sherry murders and the Dixie Mafia's involvement in that case, I do recommend that you go back and listen to the episode. While there's much discussion in Southern folklore about how exactly and when the Dixie Mafia was born, one theory has it that the group emerged out of the Appalachian states, taking root in Biloxi, Mississippi, before spreading across the southeast United States throughout the mid-late 20th century. Despite their nickname of the Cornbread Cosa Nostra, the Dixie Mafia didn't operate like traditional Italian and Eastern European crime families. In the South, common sense more than anything was the catalyst for this transient, loosely organized network of corrupt businessmen, racketeers, extortionists, money launderers, contract killers, bank robbers, bootleggers, petty thieves, pimps, and drug distributors to come together and work towards a common goal, if a nefarious goal. There was no formal, specific figurehead running the show for this motley crew of opportunists. It was simply a case of whoever held the most money held the power. There was no initiation or strict code to follow. Just one rule: thou shalt not snitch to the cops. In the early mid-20th century, the summer resort destination of Biloxi was a draw card for those wanting to indulge in illegal gambling and prostitution along the Gulf Coast. Prohibition had only made the city even more alluring to those with a penchant for vice, as bootleggers set up shop to cash in and do deals with corrupt city officials. For these folks, Mississippi was the best place to do it. Alcohol had been banned across the state since 1908, well before the 18th Amendment came into effect in 1920. Prohibition ended throughout much of the country in 1933. However, it remained in Mississippi, and yet was no deterrent to those who profited from running illegal drinking dens. Biloxi's reputation as a place where anything could be bought and sold for a price soon preceded itself. But by the 1950s, the illegal yet open gambling that had been taking place just a decade earlier was no longer. Slot machines began disappearing from the city, and in 1954, gaming was banned at the Broadwater Beach Resort. According to the FBI, the beginnings of the Dixie Mafia were starting to take shape, with Biloxi as its home base. As the city became a hotbed of organized crime, the Dixie Mafia's operations expanded across Mississippi to Hattiesburg, Jackson, and Corinth, also taking root in Dallas, Texas, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Little Rock, Arkansas, Atlanta, Georgia, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Birmingham and Phoenix City, Alabama. The group was savvy, though. They knew they couldn't conduct all of their business dealings in big cities. As an intricate network of underworld connections were made all across the South, the Dixie Mafia knew it was sometimes better to do business in remote towns where law enforcement wouldn't think to look, or was too under-resourced to do so. Towns situated on state lines like Texarkana on the Texas-Arkansas border were ideal meeting points for members who had to travel. Communications-wise, members weren't personally acquainted with many others in the network unless it was on a need-to-know basis in the course of carrying out a specific job. And if you wanted in on the action, prisons and penitentiaries were a popular recruitment method. It wasn't until 1966 that Mississippi ended statewide prohibition, though any reprieve for illegal alcohol distribution was brief. The tourist trade on the Gulf Coast was thriving. Visitors from the north came to seek out all sorts of overage fun, and there were those who would turn their hand to anything to meet demand if it meant making money. But it was high stakes being involved with the Dixie Mafia on both sides of the law. Beginning around the mid-20th century, dozens of contract killings across the South were committed, brutal executions designed to eliminate enemies intent on bringing down the Dixie Mafia or exact revenge on former members. Anyone cooperating with the police or who planned to testify in court for the prosecution had a target on their back. For these people, it was only a matter of time before they fell victim to dramatic and often sadistic execution. The killings, often public, were a warning of the consequences on offer for even entertaining the thought of crossing the Dixie Mafia. I'm going to pause now for a short commercial break. As early as 1954, Phoenix City lawyer and former Alabama State Senator Albert Patterson was assassinated during his bid to run for state attorney general. Albert worked doggedly and very publicly to stamp out corruption in the place known as the original Sin City. 3 city officials were accused of Albert's murder, but it was only Russell County Chief Deputy Sheriff Albert Fuller who was sent to prison, but he was released after only 10 years. In early August 1967, a high-profile attack in Jackson County, Georgia, shocked the community of Jefferson. Local DA and vocal aggressive opponent of the Dixie Mafia, Floyd Horde, was assassinated when a bomb rigged to the family car exploded. Just days later in Tennessee, McNairy County Sheriff Buford Pusser and his wife Pauline were violently ambushed by a group of men when the sheriff was called out to check on a disturbance out of town. Pauline had accompanied her husband as it was around dawn and quiet. Sheriff Pusser had been actively working to disrupt activities conducted by both the Dixie Mafia and the State Line Mob, with whom the Dixie Mafia was said to have links. The sheriff was severely injured in the shooting, but Pauline was tragically killed. 4 months later, in December 1967, Biloxi bookmaker Harry Bennett was murdered in a public hit outside his apartment building. Harry was due to testify against some of the Dixie Mafia when he was killed. 5 men were convicted and imprisoned for the murder of Floyd Horde, but their sentences were later commuted. And while Sheriff Pusser was certain he knew who had killed his wife, no one was ever brought to justice. The violence continued unabated. In the winter of 1969, an armed Dixie Mafia gang of around 5 men ambushed a group of carnival workers camping near Covington, Louisiana, in what became known as the Gypsy Camp Murder. The group rounded up the campers, tied them to trees, and robbed them of thousands of dollars in cash and jewelry. When fortune teller Margie George refused to cooperate, one man struck her in the head with a hatchet and another man shot her. One of the prime suspects was said to be an imposing Dixie Mafia figure named Bill Clubb, an experienced bank robber and contract killer from Texarkana. But a potential witness named Bobby Gail Gwynn turned up dead before he could testify against anyone. Ultimately, no one was prosecuted for the crime, and the case remains unsolved. A storm of a different kind wreaked havoc that August when Hurricane Camille decimated the Gulf Coast. The chips were temporarily down for Biloxi as it worked to rebuild, but the Dixie Mafia saw this as a golden opportunity to take greater control of the city. Along what was known as the Strip, illegal clubs were already part of the Biloxi scenery. Prostitution and pornography rings went hand in hand. Legitimate motels and nightclubs provided a front for illegal gambling dens, brothels, and strip clubs. For aspiring underworld figures, it was like moths to a flame. Their above-board business assets, including used car lots and junkyards, provided a front for what went on behind the scenes. Fueled by greed, multiple key players worked together to maintain operations. One well-known kingpin was affluent, well-connected, and trusted Biloxi club owner Mike Gillich Jr., known simply to many as Mr. Mike. While many of his rivals' illegal business ventures were shut down, Mike always seemed to be free to continue trading. Expanding a criminal organization by training up loyal protégés is par for the course in the underworld, and Mike Gillich found this in Kirksey Nix. Unlike Mike, who came from a poor immigrant background, Kirksey, who was highly intelligent, hailed from a privileged and educated Oklahoma family. You may remember both Mike and Kirksey from episode 91. Despite having the world as his oyster, Kirksey instead chose a life of crime. He was said to be a suspect in the murders of both Harry Bennett and Pauline Pusser back in 1967 and the Gypsy Camp murder in 1969. In the spring of 1971, Kirksey Nix and his associates killed wealthy New Orleans grocery business executive Frank Corso in a robbery gone wrong. Kirksey was convicted for murder and was sent away to serve a life sentence in Angola prison. But he kept his hand in with the Dixie Mafia operations. In the years to come, Kirksey would be convicted of running a highly profitable scam from within prison, which netted him hundreds of thousands of dollars. One case attributed to the Dixie Mafia, which remained unsolved for decades, was the horrific triple murder of Bryce Durham, his wife Virginia, and their 18-year-old son Bobby in the town of Boone, North Carolina in 1972. In the midst of a February snowstorm, the victims' strangled and drowned bodies were found laying in their bathtub. Watauga County Sheriff's Office was confident the slayings were a hit, but the unidentified killer or killers remained at large. Despite over 100 law enforcement agencies across the South doing their best to stamp out Dixie Mafia activity, it was like a game of whack-a-mole. But a big part of the problem came from within police ranks themselves. Powerful players wanting to maintain the status quo at whatever cost needed allies where it mattered. The Dixie Mafia were known to incentivize police and politicians to look the other way by offering attractive financial benefits. Cultivating close relationships with senior and not-so-senior police figures in the South was a priority to keep underworld business turning over. Keep your friends close and all that. In Biloxi, the much-needed friend in high places was Leroy Hobbs, former Gulfport police chief and sheriff of Harrison County, who came into office in 1971. Sheriff Hobbs was exactly the kind of guy the Dixie Mafia needed, and the citizens of Harrison County thought they needed too. Leroy was charismatic, with a gift of gab, and outspoken about his campaign to expose corruption in Biloxi. But as quickly as he was appointed, the lure of getting chummy with the Dixie Mafia, who paid for the authorities to let things slide, proved too great for the sheriff. Leroy was soon taking bribes from owners of illegal gambling dens and strip clubs. I'm going to pause now for a final commercial break. By the late 70s and early 80s, Sheriff Leroy Hobbs and feared Dixie Mafia figures, including club owner David DJ Venus III and Jim Blackwell, were virtually untouchable as they enjoyed the fruits of their deeply corrupt endeavors. Leroy and DJ were tight. Their frequent and public socializing after hours raised many an eyebrow, but the men seemed to have no concerns about how blurred the lines appeared in their professional relationship. Whatever efforts the upstanding and honorable men and women of Harrison County law enforcement went to at grassroots level, it made little, if any, difference while Leroy Hobbs was in charge. In 1982, DJ Venus and Jim Blackwell had a rival named Dewey DeAngelo viciously mutilated and murdered. But Leroy saw to it that any police inquiries were shut down in order to steer suspicion away from the suspects and protect their relationship. By now, organized crime was so enmeshed with the Harrison County Sheriff's Office that the FBI was knocking on the door. Private investigator Rex Armistead had long also been pursuing those at the top of the Dixie Mafia food chain. In 1983, things had deteriorated to such an extent with the Harris County Sheriff's Office that the FBI designated the entire agency as a criminal enterprise. Special agents Royce Hignite and Keith Bell spearheaded the investigation into local corruption using sophisticated means. In a sting that June, an FBI informant set up DJ Venus to bribe Leroy Hobbs into facilitating a massive cocaine drop. It went off without a hitch, and DJ, Leroy, Jim Blackwell, and other Dixie Mafia members were arrested. Agent Bell later described the extent of the corruption in Harrison County by saying, quote, "It was out of control. They were doing anything and everything illegal down here. For money, the sheriff and the officers loyal to Sheriff Hobbs would release prisoners from the county jail, safeguard drug shipments, and hide fugitives. Anything you can think of, they were involved in. Local officers wanting to eradicate the stench of corruption from their workplace were key to assisting the FBI investigation. At the same time, a clampdown began on strip joints, which soon began closing. DJ Venus, Jim Blackwell, and Leroy Hobbs pled guilty to charges brought against them in the sting. DJ received 15 years in prison, and Jim and Leroy each received 20 years. The judge telling the disgraced sheriff, quote, "You sold your soul to the devil." But Leroy Hobbs only ended up serving 12 years. By the mid-1980s, some Biloxi business leaders hoped that casinos would boost the local economy. For the Dixie Mafia, this would be a gold mine. But other citizens opposed the move, concerned about encouraging more organized crime. Operations had evolved for the Dixie Mafia all across the South, with sophisticated vehicle theft rings, selling stolen goods, and credit card and real estate fraud, now stock in trade. At the same time, in the Appalachian coal fields, a massive, multi-jurisdictional enterprise involving fraudulent leases and mining equipment theft was also operating. Miami, Mobile, Alabama, Fort Worth, Texas, Memphis, Tennessee, and the Carolinas were all now home to the flourishing Dixie Mafia. Law enforcement from New Orleans to Dallas was doing its best to gather intelligence to shut down operations. But it was like trying to put out a wildfire with a leaky hose, with many of the other firefighters who were supposedly helping you lighting the fires themselves. The feds and local law enforcement hoped the very public downfall of Leroy Hobbs and the convictions of DJ Venus and Jim Blackwell were the beginning of the end for the Dixie Mafia. Well, in Harrison County at least. But one final shocking event would prove the fight wasn't over, and it wouldn't be for some years. As I mentioned earlier, the Dixie Mafia were key players in the 1987 double murder of Circuit Court Judge and former attorney Vincent Sherry and his wife and Biloxi mayoral candidate Margaret. The couple was brutally murdered in their home. Vincent's body was discovered by his close friend and former business partner, attorney Pete Hallett, who would go on to become mayor of Biloxi 2 years later. Judge Sherry had formerly represented prominent club owner Mike Gillich, or Mr. Mike. I'm not going to repeat all the ins and outs of the case here. Suffice it to say that when it came to eventual convictions related to the Sherry case in both 1991 and later in 1996, Kirksey Nix, Mike Gillich, and Pete Hallett, along with others, all did prison time, but not on standalone murder charges. To find out how all that unfolded and why, you'll need to go listen to the episode. By the late 90s, the face of Biloxi was changing, with the closure of illegal clubs in full swing following the legalization of gambling in 1990. Public officials knew they were under scrutiny to not only clean up the city but purge the once rotten core of any agencies which had been tainted by corruption. It was a similar story over in Louisiana, where the heat was being turned up on former Governor Edwin Edwards, who'd held a record 4 terms in office between 1972 and 1996. Despite beating 2 corruption trials and 22 state and federal grand juries, and evading conviction over a conspiracy to sell construction permits for hospitals and nursing homes, in 2001, the hugely popular Edwards was sentenced to 10 years in prison for racketeering and extortion. It had been proven that during his last term, Edwards had rigged Louisiana's riverboat casino licensing process. It's not clear whether the former governor was ever explicitly associated with the Dixie Mafia, but it gives you an overall idea of how ingrained corruption was at the highest levels of Southern politics over such an extended period. With numerous Dixie Mafia figures finally imprisoned for considerable stretches by the 2000s, it appeared the head of the snake was finally cut off. More sophisticated intelligence gathering in conjunction with sentencing and parole reform and widespread community support saw the Dixie Mafia become a shadow of its former self. And here's a nice postscript to prove it. Over 45 years after the triple murder of the Durham family, in 2019, a man named Shane Burt contacted the sheriff's office in White County, Georgia. Shane was researching the life of his late father, convicted killer Billy Sunday Burt. Billy had died 2 years earlier in prison, where he was doing life for 3 murders from the 1970s. He was said to be responsible for as many as 50 contract killings. Shane explained that his father revealed during a previous visit that he had killed, quote, 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a heavy snowstorm. Of the 3 other suspects in the case, only one was still alive, 81-year-old Billy Wayne Davis, who was sentenced to life in Georgia for a 1971 murder in Douglas County. It wasn't until 2022 that case was announced as solved, after Davis admitted to being the getaway driver. Beyond confirmation that the murders were a hit, it wasn't revealed why they were committed or whether Davis would be charged. Nevertheless, it's proof that it's never too late for anyone with information to come forward. Only time will tell whether the corruption which historically plagued many cities and counties across the South is something to remain concerned about. While many of the key players in this story have since passed away, either from natural causes or as an occupational hazard, we're all familiar with the adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Gemma Harris. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messaging. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit ass is allowed. It's not just a motto, it is how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm also on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, and now Amazon and Audible. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.